The harsh halogen lamps buzzed overhead, sending a sharp spike of pain right behind Arthur's temples. He yanked the floor buffer's heavy block cable out of the way, his worn steel-toe boots scuffing the faded linoleum. One stupid mistake up in the Platinum Suites, one unlocked mahogany entryway. That is exactly how an absolute nobody with a mop bucket collides with the fiercely protected universe of a corporate titan. The generic industrial pine soap didn't carry a hint of real nature. It reeked of harsh solvents and cheap labor, a bitter synthetic bite that coated the roof of Arthur's mouth. He dragged the waterlogged sponge mop across the 30th floor's scuffed tiles, the gray strings hitting the wall trim with a repetitive sloppy smack. The clock on the wall read 11:20 p.m. Outside the narrow windows, the sprawling metropolis was a blur of crimson taillights and amber street lamps. Inside Vanguard Dynamics, however, the atmosphere was dead, chilly, arid, and pushed through endless channels of galvanized steel. Arthur paused, letting his weight sink into the wooden handle. A vicious, throbbing cramp in his right shoulder flared, shooting straight down his spine to his bad hip. He was only 32, but his skeleton felt ancient. The stiff, dark green fabric of his custodian shirt stuck to his ribs, crusted with dried sweat and reeking of burnt espresso, the ghost of a massive spill he had scraped out of the dispatch rug 4 hours ago. He jammed a rough knuckle into his left eye, desperate to clear his blurry vision. He couldn't care less about the massive corporate mergers negotiated in these rooms. The fluctuating profit margins flashing across the lobby monitors meant absolutely nothing to him. Arthur's mind was locked on raw survival math. The electricity bill was due Friday, and he was $90 short. Tonight's double shift knocked out $40. If he begged for a weekend dishwashing gig at the diner down the street, that might pull in another $50. It left just enough for peanut butter, pasta, and the expensive allergy medicine for little Leo. Leo. Just thinking about his 6-year-old boy triggered a dull ache right under Arthur's breastbone. The kid was probably dead asleep right now, huddled under a faded superhero quilt on Miss Vance's lumpy couch, 3 doors down the hall from their own cramped unit. He could practically see the way Leo clutched the fabric, listening to the subtle wheeze in his throat whenever the old radiator baked the moisture out of the room. He despised leaving his son there. He loathed the sympathetic head tilt Miss Vance gave him every single Friday when he handed her a stack of crinkled $10 bills. But a widowed father carrying a GED and a wrecked hip couldn't afford dignity. Arthur heaved the oversized yellow bucket forward, the murky water splashing against the plastic lip, and shuffled toward the utility lift. The caster wheels shrieked an awful high-pitched scrape that bounced off the barren walls. He tapped his keycard on the black reader. A harsh beep sounded, followed by a green flash. The metal doors slid apart. The crumpled schedule shoved in his pocket clearly stated he only needed to finish level 30 and head home. But the shift supervisor, a constantly pacing guy named Miller who thrived on micromanagement, cornered him near the punch clock. Executive suite needs a sweep, Artie. Somebody trashed the main conference room. Stay away from the primary desk. Just bag the trash and disappear. Level 60, the apex, the absolute territory of Victoria Vance. Even the graveyard shift janitors only discussed the founder in nervous, hushed murmurs. She wasn't just a chief executive. She was a terrifying force of nature, a predator who bought out struggling pharmaceutical labs, gutted their assets, and laid off thousands without blinking an eye. Arthur had spotted her exactly once, months ago. She swept through the ground floor atrium, flanked by lawyers. He remembered the sharp, authoritative crack of her leather boots on the marble and the faint, icy scent of expensive linen and expensive linen. She never glanced his way. To her, he was just part of the drywall, a background prop wearing a green uniform and carrying a trash bag. That was perfectly fine with him. Staying unseen meant staying safe. Staying unseen meant putting food on the table. The elevator pinged, a soft melodic chime. The steel doors glided open and the entire vibe of the building transformed. Down below, the flooring was cheap, abrasive carpeting designed to survive an army of careless boots. Up here, Arthur stepped onto a thick, slate-gray rug that completely absorbed the heavy thud of his footsteps. The harsh overhead tubes vanished, replaced by subtle, warm spotlights that painted gentle shadows across walls lined with authentic, rich walnut wood. Arthur parked his squeaky bucket in the foyer. He snapped a thick garbage liner off his belt and gripped his dusting rag. His heart rate kicked up a notch. He wasn't supposed to breathe this air. Being in the executive wing always made him feel like a burglar creeping through a high-end jewelry store. He padded down the dead-silent hallway. The scent here was entirely different. No cheap bleach or burnt coffee. It smelled of rich leather, expensive wood polish, and the faint hum of climate-controlled servers. The conference room was a breeze. 4 crumpled water bottles, a pile of torn legal pads, and a wiped-down glass board. He knotted the top of the plastic bag, the crinkling sound aggressively loud in the total silence. He glanced at his worn wristwatch, 11:42 p.m. If he moved fast, he could sprint to the midnight train, avoid the freezing drizzle outside, and hit his mattress by 1. He backed out of the conference room and stared down the corridor at the very last door. Victoria Vance, founder and CEO. The frosted silver lettering caught the ambient light. The heavy door wasn't clicked shut. A sliver of pale yellow illumination spilled through the narrow gap, cutting across the slate carpet. Arthur froze in his tracks. Management constantly drilled into them that her personal office was strictly forbidden unless they received a direct ticket, but Miller had specifically ordered him to dump the bins. If he left garbage rotting in the CEO's private sanctuary, Miller would slice his wages. If he walked in and knocked something over, he was out on the street. He stood paralyzed for a solid 10 seconds, grinding his teeth, calculating the odds. The tower was deserted. Security had cleared the upper management out hours ago. Victoria Vance was surely at some upscale restaurant. The light was just an oversight by a rushing secretary. He reached out with a scarred hand and gripped the brushed steel handle. He pushed it forward, bracing himself for the massive, echoing emptiness of a rich person's workspace. The solid walnut door swung open without a single sound. Arthur took a step inside, the plastic liner brushing against his denim jeans. He kept his gaze locked on the floor, hunting for the wastebasket. He didn't look up right away. First, he noticed a pair of sharp black pumps discarded carelessly on a woven rug. Then a heap of dark silk, a custom blazer tossed over the arm of a velvet couch. "I specifically told you to leave the files with the receptionist, David," a voice cut through the room. It was a woman's voice, raspy, low, and heavy with pure, unadulterated exhaustion. Arthur turned to stone. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, a frantic drumming that knocked all the oxygen right out of his throat. He jerked his head up. Victoria Vance stood less than 12 feet away, illuminated by the harsh glow of a single architect's lamp on her desk. She wasn't sitting in her leather chair. She was standing dead center in the room, and she was half undressed. The crisp, impossibly expensive white dress shirt she wore was completely unbuttoned, sliding off one bare, pale shoulder. But the shirt wasn't what glued Arthur's boots to the floor. It was the fact that both her hands were awkwardly twisted behind her back, fingers fighting desperately to unhook something rigid encasing her torso. It was a massive, heavy-duty orthopedic carapace. Thick canvas straps and metallic struts clamped viciously around her lower spine. As she twisted, the skin around the edges pulled tight, exposing a horrific canvas of deep, mottled bruising, ugly shades of violent purple bleeding into her pale sides. Arthur couldn't move a muscle. He forgot how to breathe. The trash bag dangling from his fist suddenly felt like an anvil. His mind completely flatlined, hijacked by raw, primitive terror. "I'm done. Oh my God, I'm fired. I'm going to lose the apartment. Victoria turned her head, clearly annoyed by the silence. She froze. She didn't shriek. She didn't gasp or scramble to pull her shirt closed like someone caught off guard. Her hands simply dropped away from the metal buckles, falling limp at her sides. For 4 agonizing seconds, the silence inside that office was absolute. Even the muted rumble of the metropolis 60 stories down seemed to evaporate. Arthur stared at her. Victoria stared right back. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with red exhaustion, framed by loose strands of blonde hair that had fallen from a strict bun. Her expression was a terrifying mask of pure, icy calculation. She analyzed his cheap green work shirt. She analyzed his face, pale and wide-eyed under the brim of his faded cap. Finally, her gaze dropped to the garbage bag trembling in his grip. "You are not David," she said. Her tone carried 0 volume, but it sliced through the dead air like a straight razor. Arthur choked. His throat felt like crocked earth. "I'm sorry. The door. Miller told me to." He scrambled backward, his heels snagging on the edge of the woven rug, he barely catching himself. He refused to break eye contact, terrified that if he looked away, she would call security and end his life. "Leave," she ordered. Flat. Empty. "I didn't know anyone was in here," Arthur stammered, his chest seizing with panic. The desperate need for that $90 vanished instantly, entirely consumed by the blinding image of an eviction notice nailed to his door. "I swear to God, ma'am, I didn't see a thing. I was just taking out the trash." "I said," Victoria repeated, her voice dropping into a deadly low register, "leave." Arthur didn't need to hear it a third time. He hauled the heavy wooden door backward, practically tripping over his own boots as he scrambled out into the hallway. The door slammed shut with a heavy, definitive thud, sealing him outside in the quiet corridor. He collapsed back against the walnut-paneled wall, his breathing rapid and echoing in his own ears. His fingers went numb, and the dusting rag slipped from his grip, landing without a sound on the thick gray carpet. "Stupid, stupid, idiotic," he whispered frantically, squeezing his eyes shut and pressing the heels of his hands brutally against his temples. He had just walked in on the absolute ruler of Vanguard dynamics. He had witnessed something she violently protected from the outside world. A billionaire didn't strap themselves into a heavy-duty spinal cage unless something inside them was fundamentally, deeply broken. Someone with that kind of net worth despised nobodies like Arthur stumbling into their private nightmares. He stood completely still, waiting for the inevitable ring of a desk phone. He fully expected the muffled, furious voice of Victoria Vance commanding building security to drag the creeping floor sweeper out by his collar and shred his access card. A full minute dragged by, then 2. Nothing happened. The corridor stayed dead silent. Arthur slowly crouched and retrieved his dusting rag. His fingers were trembling violently. He backed away toward the elevator, practically running, the squeaky wheels of his yellow bucket shrieking as he hauled it toward the service closet. He had to punch out. He had to escape before the guards marched down to the basement lockers. By the time he hit the freezing night air outside, the light drizzle had turned into a punishing sleet. Arthur zipped his thin jacket up to his chin and started the miserable walk toward the transit stop. His bad hip throbbed aggressively with every single step. He couldn't stop replaying the scene in his mind. Her cold, exhausted eyes, the horrific purple bruises staining her ribs, the cruel, industrial grip of that back brace. She hadn't looked humiliated. She had looked like a cornered animal caught in a bear trap, waiting to see if the poacher was going to pull the trigger. Arthur climbed onto the deserted late-night bus, fumbling with his fare using numb fingers. He dropped into a hard plastic seat near the back doors, staring blindly as the city lights blurred across the wet glass. He tried to convince himself it was over. A stupid accident. A scheduling screw-up by Miller. Tomorrow his badge would just flash red at the turnstile. He'd have to swallow his pride, beg Miller for his final check, borrow against next month's food budget and find another graveyard shift scrubbing floors for peanuts. He leaned his forehead against the rattling window, the heavy diesel engine vibrating through his bones. He had no idea that 60 floors up, in an office smelling of rich leather and eucalyptus, Victoria Vance sat in the dark. The metal brace lay unfastened on her desk. She held a glass of expensive bourbon, staring at the closed door, perfectly memorizing the raw, desperate terror she had seen in the janitor's face. The alarm clock went off at 4:30 p.m. It wasn't a soft digital beep. It was a harsh mechanical buzzing that rattled against the cheap wood of the nightstand. Arthur slammed his palm down on the button, his hand stinging from the impact. He stared up at the water-stained ceiling in the dim bedroom. The stain looked like a deformed map of South America. His hip throbbed in perfect rhythm with his pulse, a constant, miserable companion. From the tiny living room, he heard the faint, high-pitched whistle of Leo's breathing. The kid was coloring, the cheap crayon scraping aggressively against printer paper. Arthur dragged himself out of bed. He felt completely drained. The sheer panic from the previous night had settled into a heavy, suffocating block of dread in his gut. Today was the day. He would walk up to Vanguard Dynamics, scan his card, and the light would flash red. The guards would pull him aside. They would hand him a sad cardboard box containing his spare boots and coffee thermos, and they would escort him to the sidewalk. He stood in the shower for 20 minutes, letting the lukewarm water beat against his shoulders, desperately trying to wash off the feeling of impending disaster. He poured Leo a bowl of cheap store-brand cereal and packed his lunch using the tough end pieces of bread. "Dad, you look sick," Leo said, chewing loudly, his little legs swinging against the chair. "Just didn't sleep well, buddy," Arthur lied smoothly, forcing a strange smile. He pressed a kiss to the boy's forehead. His skin felt a fraction too warm. Arthur swallowed hard, suppressing a wave of absolute terror. By 10 p.m., Arthur was standing in the freezing sleet outside the massive glass facade of Vanguard Dynamics. He pulled his collar tight against the wind, staring at the revolving doors. He felt like a condemned man walking to the firing squad. He stepped inside. The lobby was a massive cavern of polished stone and recycled air, smelling sharply of floor wax. He walked toward the employee gates. His hand was visibly shaking as he pulled the ID lanyard from his pocket. He tapped the card against the black scanner. Beep! The light flashed bright green. The metal barrier clicked open. Arthur blinked, stunned. He pushed his way through, his heart stuttering in his chest. A system error. Maybe human resources just hadn't finalized the paperwork yet. He took the stairs down to the basement locker room. The air down there was thick with the smell of wet wool and cheap bleach. Miller was standing right next to the time clock, his ever-present clipboard jammed under his arm. Miller looked up, his eyes narrowing instantly as he spotted Arthur. Here it comes, Arthur thought. Miller let out a grunt, chewing aggressively on his thumb. Leave the cart. Arthur froze, his hand hovering over his locker combination dial. Listen, Miller, about last night, I can explain. I don't care, Miller snapped, looking incredibly nervous. He jabbed a thick finger toward the ceiling. You're off floor duty. They want you upstairs, level 60. Arthur felt the floor drop completely out of under him. The executive suite. They weren't just quietly firing him, they were dragging him up to the top to make an absolute example of him. Who? Arthur asked, his voice cracking. The assistant, Mr. Sterling, said you need to go straight up. Don't punch in, just move. Miller spun around and walked away, grumbling something about union reps. Arthur dropped his faded cap onto the wooden bench. He walked to the main elevators, the silence ringing in his ears. The ride up took exactly 48 seconds. He counted every single one. The steel doors slid open. That same thick slate gray carpet instantly swallowed the sound of his boots. The air was frigid, carrying that distinct scent of eucalyptus and expensive linen. A man wearing an impossibly sharp navy suit stood waiting in the foyer, Mr. Sterling. The guy looked like he was carved out of solid ice. "Arthur," Sterling said. It wasn't phrased as a question. "Follow me." Sterling didn't march him toward a security holding room. He led Arthur straight down the main hallway, past the dark conference room, directly to the heavy walnut door with frosted silver lettering, Victoria Vance. Sterling pushed the door open, motioned for Arthur to step inside, and immediately pulled the door shut behind him. The office felt entirely different, lit only by the ambient glow of the city bleeding through the massive windows. It was flawless, terrifying. Victoria Vance sat behind the massive expanse of her desk. She wore a perfectly tailored black jacket, sitting with impossible, rigid posture. Her hair was pulled back tightly. She was reviewing a tablet, her face lit by the cold blue screen. She didn't bother to look up when he walked in. Arthur stood awkwardly on the woven rug. The silence in the room was pulled tight enough to snap. He could hear the faint, steady hum of the ventilation system. He shifted his stance, his bad hip sending a sharp twinge down his leg. "I'm sorry." The words tumbled out of Arthur's mouth, tasting like pennies. "I know I wasn't supposed to be in here. I'm sorry. I saw—" "Sit down," she interrupted, cutting him off completely. Arthur snapped his jaw shut. He glanced at the pristine white leather chairs positioned across from her desk. He hesitated, painfully aware of the grease stains on his work pants. He perched awkwardly on the very edge of the cushion, keeping his spine ramrolled straight. Victoria finally raised her eyes. They were piercing, completely free of the red exhausted look from the night before, though the skin underneath looked heavily bruised, masked by thick makeup. "You didn't go to the media," she stated flatly. "No." "You didn't inform your supervisor." "No." "Why?" Arthur stared right back at her. The question felt like a landmine. "Because I desperately need this paycheck. I clean toilets for $15 an hour. If I start talking about the CEO, I'm out on the street. I have rent due. I have a kid. I literally cannot afford to care about whatever secrets you have." It was the most brutally honest thing he had spoken in years. The raw truth of it just hung heavily in the freezing air. Victoria held his gaze without blinking. Then she reached into a drawer and pulled out a plain manila folder. She slid it across the glass. It stopped exactly 1 inch from Arthur's hands. "I had Sterling run a deep background check on you this morning. Arthur Evans, 32. Honorable discharge, Army medics. Destroyed your hip during a training drop. Widowed father, drowning in debt to a local clinic for pediatric allergy treatments. Credit score hovering around 510. Clean record. Desperate." Arthur felt his face burn with intense humiliation and a sudden, violent spike of rage. His hands curled into tight fists resting on his thighs. "You have no right to—" "I was in a private plane crash 4 months ago," Victoria said, abruptly changing the subject and stopping his anger dead in its tracks. She leaned back in her leather chair. The movement was agonizingly slow, calculated. "Pilot error. We went down hard in the Rockies. The media believes I was at a wellness retreat in Switzerland. The board of directors thinks I had a minor skiing tumble. The reality is I fractured 3 vertebrae and shattered 4 ribs." Arthur remained dead silent. The image of that brutal mechanical spine cage flashed vividly in his mind, the horrifying spread of purple bruises. "The board smells blood in the water," she continued, her tone completely devoid of emotion. "Vanguard Dynamics is deep into a hostile acquisition of a massive biotech firm. If the shareholders discover their CEO is literally bolted together with metal and canvas, entirely incapable of sitting upright for more than 2 hours with heavy narcotics, the stock will plummet. They'll trigger a medical clause and throw me out by the end of the week." "Why are you telling me this?" Arthur asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the AC. "Because I am currently bribing 3 private doctors, an entire flight crew, and a discreet clinic to stay quiet. My assistant, Sterling, manipulates my calendar to hide my physical therapy sessions, but Sterling weighs 140 pounds soaking wet. He cannot physically lift me out of a town car when my spine completely seizes. He cannot tighten a thoracic brace. She leaned forward, carefully bracing her elbows against the glass surface. She winced, just a microscopic tightening of her jaw muscles. I require someone who knows how to keep their mouth shut, someone who exists entirely outside my corporate bubble, someone who needs the cash so desperately they will execute my orders instantly without asking a single question. She stared pointedly at his calloused, stained hands. I need a handler. Arthur stared back in disbelief. You want me to be your nurse? I want you to be my shadow, she corrected him sharply. You will drive the private vehicles. You will carry the luggage. You will stand quietly in the corners of gala events holding my medication. And when my back completely gives out, you will physically hold me upright so the press doesn't get a photo of me collapsing. Arthur let out a short, bitter laugh. I'm a janitor. I have a bad hip. You were an army medic. You know exactly how to carry dead weight. She tapped the manila folder with a manicured nail. I will pay you $3,000 a week in cash. You will receive premium corporate health insurance for both you and your son, effective right now. $3,000 a week. Premium medical. The numbers slammed into Arthur like a freight train. That was more than he cleared in 3 agonizing months. That meant a new apartment in a safe building. That meant the top-tier specialists for Leo. The suffocating, crushing weight of poverty that had been drowning him for 5 long years suddenly crocked open, letting in a blinding, terrifying rush of oxygen. What's the catch? He asked, his hands shaking slightly. You belong entirely to me, Victoria stated, her eyes dead and serious. 0 days off until this acquisition closes in 6 weeks. If you make a mistake, if you open your mouth, if you ever look at me with an ounce of pity, I will destroy your life. I will ensure you can't get a job picking up trash in this entire state. Arthur stared at the billionaire sitting across from him. He saw the freezing arrogance, the absolute need for control, but right beneath the edge of her crisp collar, he caught the faint red indent of a canvas drop digging painfully into her collarbone. She was terrified. She was bleeding out in a pool of sharks, and she was paying the closest peasant to act as a human tourniquet. He didn't like her. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with her cutthroat world. When do I start? He asked. The transition was brutally abrupt. On Wednesday, Arthur was scrubbing toilets. By Friday, he was trapped in a custom block suit that cost more than his entire net worth, standing silently next to an armored block SUV in the subterranean executive parking garage. The suit felt wrong. It was expertly tailored, but Arthur had the thick, muscular shoulders of someone who did hard labor, and the expensive fabric pulled uncomfortably tight across his back. The collar felt like a noose. He felt like a stray dog shoved into a tuxedo. The first 2 weeks were a punishing masterclass in the exhausting logistics of extreme wealth. Victoria Vance didn't actually live a life. She executed a flawless military operation. Her schedule kicked off at 5 a.m. and rarely ended before midnight. She bounced between glass-walled boardrooms, exclusive restaurants that reeked of truffles and stale cigars, and a sprawling penthouse that felt more like a modern art gallery than a place to sleep. Arthur became the invisible scaffolding holding her together. He quickly learned the subtle tells. When her left hand gripped a table edge so intensely her knuckles went white, it meant the nerve damage in her spine was acting up. When her voice dropped to a frighteningly calm whisper during a tense negotiation, it meant she was fighting off intense nausea from the heavy painkillers. Their working relationship was far from friendly. It was strictly transactional, deeply abrasive, and loaded with a quiet mutual resentment. Take the speed bumps slower, Evans, she stopped from the box seat of the SUV during a heavy downpour on a Tuesday. I didn't hire you to test the shock absorbers. The shocks are fine, Arthur replied flatly, his hands tight on the leather steering wheel. The city hasn't repaved this street since the 90s. Do you want me to take the detour and make you 10 minutes late for the merger meeting? I just want you to drive the car without the running commentary, she snapped, her voice strained and thin. Arthur flicked his eyes to the rearview mirror. Her eyes were squeezed shut, one pale hand pressed brutally against her lower ribs. The passing streetlights painted her face in shades of concrete gray. Arthur didn't feel pity. He knew exactly what it meant to endure silently. Pain is a universal language, completely indifferent to the balance in your checking account. The driving was actually the easy part. The real nightmare began when the heavy deadbolts of her penthouse finally clicked shut. The terrifying corporate titan completely dissolved. Without the board of directors watching her every move, the adrenaline simply vanished, leaving behind the ruined shell of her actual body. The permanent shift in their arrangement happened during the third week. They had just survived a brutal 5-hour dinner negotiation with a group of Swiss biotech investors. Victoria walked into her sprawling foyer, her movements stiff and completely unnatural. She made it exactly 2 steps towards the velvet sofa before her legs simply quit working. Arthur caught her before her knees hit the imported tile. He hooked his arms under hers, his heavy boots bracing against the floor to absorb the shock. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp of pure agony, her perfectly manicured nails digging savagely into the sleeves of his expensive suit. She smelled of vintage wine and cold, panicked sweat. "Don't," she hissed through clenched teeth, desperately trying to shove him away. "I can stand up." "No, you absolutely cannot," Arthur fired back. His voice dropped into the flat, unyielding tone he used back in his army medic days. He didn't ask for permission or wait for her to argue. He scooped her up, his bad hips screaming in violent protest, and carried her straight down the long hall to the master bedroom. He set her down gently on the massive, silk-sheeted mattress. She was shivering violently, her breathing reduced to shallow, frantic gasps. "The brace," she choked out, pointing frantically at her ribs. "It locked up. The clasp won't release." Arthur dropped to his knees right in front of her. The sudden physical closeness was incredibly jarring. For weeks, she had just been a demanding voice from the backseat of a town car. Now, he was inches away from her. He saw the deep, exhausted lines around her eyes and the sheer misery carved into her expression. He reached up under the hem of her blazer, his rough, calloused fingers accidentally brushing the expensive silk of her blouse. He located the heavy metal clasps of the orthopedic cage. They were industrial-grade ratchets, the kind meant for severe structural trauma. The locking pin on her left side had bent sharply inward, digging viciously into the bruised tissue of her ribs. "I'm going to have to force it," Arthur said, looking up to meet her eyes. "It's going to hurt." Victoria stared at him. She looked completely terrified, and for the first time, entirely human. She gave a single, tight nod. Arthur gripped the metal lever firmly. He braced his forearm against the rigid canvas shell, making absolutely sure not to put any pressure on her actual skin. He yanked hard. The metal fought him for a second, then gave way with a loud, violent snap. Victoria let out a choked, wet sob. Her posture completely collapsed, her forehead dropping heavily on Arthur's shoulder. He froze. He was a guy who scrubbed floors for a living. She was worth $1 billion. He was acutely aware of his cheap drugstore deodorant and the faint smell of engine exhaust clinging to his jacket, but he didn't dare pull away. He stayed perfectly still, just letting her breathe, letting her hide her face in the cheap wool of his jacket. Very slowly, he unlaced the rest of the binding. He peeled the heavy, sweat-soaked canvas away from her back and dropped it on the floor. She sat up slowly, pulling her shirt tight across her chest, her breathing finally starting to level out. The silence in that bedroom was thick, heavy with the terrifying vulnerability of what had just happened. "Thank you," she whispered, staring at the far wall instead of at him. "You're welcome," Arthur replied. He stood up, his damaged hip popping loudly in the quiet room. He turned to walk out, but a quiet rustling sound stopped him. He looked back. Victoria was holding a crumpled piece of paper that had fallen out of his pocket when he knelt. It was a crayon drawing, a shaky green spaceship and a little stick figure wearing a red hat. Victoria stared at the drawing, her thumb gently brushing over the waxy lines. "Leo?" "Yeah," Arthur said, a sudden fierce protectiveness flaring up in his chest. He reached out and gently took the paper back. "My son." "Is the insurance covering the allergy specialists?" The razor-sharp corporate edge was completely gone from her voice. "Yeah," Arthur said softly. "He got the top-tier auto-injectors on Monday. He hasn't had a reaction all week." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the dark, permanent bags under her eyes and the constant tension pulling at her shoulders. "Good," she said quietly. "Make sure Sterling clears your schedule for Sunday. Take him to the aquarium." Arthur stared at her, genuinely shocked. He gave a slow nod. "Good night, Miss Vance." "When it's just us, Arthur," she called out to his back as he reached the door, "it's Victoria." The annual charity auction at the Art Institute smelled of expensive gin and the suffocating arrogance of the ultra-rich. It was the absolute final social hurdle before the biotech acquisition closed. Arthur stood near a marble column, the stiff collar of his tuxedo scratching uncomfortably at his neck. His eyes never left Victoria. She wore a stunning, high-waisted navy gown, meticulously tailored to hide the bulky canvas cage underneath. She was holding a crystal glass of champagne that she hadn't touched. She had been standing for 3 solid hours. Arthur watched her left hand drift toward a cocktail table. Her fingers locked onto the linen cloth. Her knuckles immediately went bone white. "She's going down." Marcus Thorne, a notoriously aggressive board member, started walking toward her with 2 partners. They were smiling, but it was the kind of smile wolves give before tearing apart a stray dog. If she showed weakness right now, they would halt the merger, demand a full medical audit, and throw her out. Arthur didn't wait for her to signal. He moved fast. He cut aggressively through the wealthy crowd, sliding smoothly to Victoria's left, physically blocking Thorne just as the man opened his mouth to speak. "Miss Vance," Arthur interrupted, his voice loud and flat. "The London server farm is completely offline. They need your immediate authorization to reroute the data." Thorne scowled deeply. "We are in the middle of a conversation, young man." Arthur stared right through him. "I apologize, sir, but London will not wait." He offered Victoria his arm. The second her hand clamped onto his sleeve, Arthur felt the horrifying extent of her physical collapse. She was in absolute free fall. He silently absorbed almost all of her body weight, steering her quickly away from the board members, out of the gallery and straight down a dark service corridor. He kicked open the door to a utility closet and locked it behind them. "I just want you to drive the car without the running commentary," she snapped, her voice strained and thin. Arthur flicked his eyes to the rearview mirror. Her eyes were squeezed shut, one pale hand pressed brutally against her lower ribs. The passing streetlights painted her face in shades of concrete gray. Arthur didn't feel pity. He knew exactly what it meant to endure silently. Pain is a universal language, completely indifferent to the balance in your checking account. The driving was actually the easy part. The real nightmare began when the heavy deadbolts of her penthouse finally clicked shut. The terrifying corporate titan completely dissolved. Without the board of directors watching her every move, the adrenaline simply vanished, leaving behind the ruined shell of her actual body. The permanent shift in their arrangement happened during the 3rd week. They had just survived a brutal 5-hour dinner negotiation with a group of Swiss biotech investors. Victoria walked into her sprawling foyer, her movements stiff and completely unnatural. She made it exactly 2 steps toward the velvet sofa before her legs simply quit working. Arthur caught her before her knees hit the imported tile. He hooked his arms under hers, his heavy boots bracing against the floor to absorb the shock. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp of pure agony, her perfectly manicured nails digging savagely into the sleeves of his expensive suit. She smelled of vintage wine and cold, panicked sweat. "Don't," she hissed, through clenched teeth, desperately trying to shove him away. "I can stand up." "No, you absolutely cannot," Arthur fired back. His voice dropped into the flat, unyielding tone he used back in his army medic days. He didn't ask for permission or wait for her to argue. He scooped her up, his bad hip screaming in violent protest, and carried her straight down the long hall to the master bedroom.